Hi guys, this is Lauren with Lauren Watkins Art, and today we are going to be doing a deep dive into pastel pencils. We're going to talk about how they work, pros and cons, and tips and tricks of this wonderful art supply. So what are pastel pencils? Well, the name tells you all you need to know. They are pastels in a pencil form. The colored core is the same pigments and binders commonly found in soft pastels, but it's encased in a wood binding, or a wood barrel, allowing you to sharpen and manipulate these in a way that you would use a traditional pencil. So you can get fine details and fine lines and get into really small spots on your painting, but using traditional soft pastel binders allows you to manipulate them and blend them how you would blend a soft pastel. So, what are the differences between colored pencils and pastel pencils? Well, the main difference is how they are manufactured. Colored pencils have either an oil or a wax-based binder holding the pigment together, and oftentimes they are more compressed and firmer in texture. But the binders and how they are manufactured gives them different qualities than your pastel pencils. So an oil-based colored pencil has an oil binder mixed in to hold the pigment together and allow it to adhere to the paper when it's drawn on. And the oil-based pencils, so your polychromos or your Derwent Light Fast pencils, tend to be a little bit more translucent, so you can layer them up and almost color mix on the paper to achieve the exact color you want, or really soft blends. They smudge a little bit. You can see the light green and the dark green example on the top. There's a little bit of smudging when I tried blending them, but not a lot of color transfer. How you get different colors is by how you layer them up on the paper. You can still get kind of that waxy buildup on the paper that makes it so you can't add any more layers. So it's something you have to keep in mind. Next up is the wax-based pencils. So these are your traditional colored pencils that you probably grew up using, like your Crayola colored pencils. Prismacolor colored pencils are an example of really high quality wax-based pencils. These tend to be more opaque than your oil-based colored pencils, and they tend to not smudge or blend quite as easily. So they're a little bit more work to get your blends on your paper. You have to build your layers a little bit more softly because they're even more prone to that wax bloom that can make it so you can't adhere any more color. I really like my wax-based pencils in my sketchbook because I don't get as much color transfer. I also like using them for the finishing details on a picture because it can cover anything that's underneath it. So pastel pencils we talked about earlier have the traditional binders used in your soft pastels. So that's your gum tragacanth, that's your gum arabic. There's some other binders used, and they are a firm soft pastel, if that makes sense. But you can see they blended a ton when I blended them, and they even blend when you mix them on the paper. So you can blend them by layering them or by manually blending them by using your hand. And there's some other ways we're going to touch on later. Pastel pencils are softer than your traditional colored pencils. They are also a little bit more fragile and crumbly, so you can see the dust building up on the paper as I work. And that just comes with the realm of soft pastels. So if you are used to colored pencils, soft pastels could be a little bit frustrating because they are a little bit more messy and you can get a lot of smudging. I am really cautious about when I use soft pastels in something like a sketchbook, because they transfer a lot. So you have to have a sketchbook that's designed to work with pastels so that you don't transfer all your color and get a lot of smudging. So one thing I wanted to also demonstrate with the colored pencils versus pastel pencils is their opacity. So the first color I did was the polychromos white, and now we're going to do the Prismacolor white. And I'm going to compare the two pencils with a soft pastel pencil. And you can see them on this toned paper that this pastel Caran d'Ache pencil is way more opaque, and it filled in the tooth of the paper really quickly. There's not as much white showing through. But this example over the black marker really shows you how opaque or translucent they are. So there's the polychromos oil-based pencil. In the middle is the Prismacolor pencil, and now our pastel pencil. And you can see how much more of the black the Caran d'Ache pastel pencil covers. The wax-based pencils are more opaque than the polychromos, but there is some differences when looking at opacity between those pencils. So how soft are pastel pencils in comparison to your traditional soft pastels? So I have kind of a spectrum lined up, where on the left, those rectangular pencils are Prismacolor new pastels, and they are very, very hard. Next to them are the Rembrandt ones, which are also a very hard brand of pastel. And all the way on to the right, you have your Schmincke pastel soft pastels, and they are very, very delicate, and they are very, very soft. So there's kind of a spectrum, and I'm testing them out on 2 different textures of paper, so you can kind of see that texture showing through. Because the softer the pastel is, the more it's going to fill up the texture of the paper. So the toned paper is Canson Mitance paper, and the white paper is a rough pressed watercolor paper. And you can see how skippy and how much white is showing through on those new pastels versus how much is covered on the Schmincke red and green pastels on the far right. So I'm going to show you on a broader sense, because this is where it becomes a lot more apparent. So comparing the green new pastel to a mid firmness soft pastel, and you can see how the pink covers up so much more of the paper. And I didn't have to do as many strokes back and forth. That's because it's really soft. What I found with the pastel pencils is they fall in a spectrum between the new pastels and kind of those middle ones. Those are Jack Richardson soft pastels. They can be a little bit firmer than the new pastels, or they can be a little bit softer. And some of it depends on brand and some of it depends on color, but they tend to be on that firmer side because they have to withstand being sharpened and kind of the wear and tear that comes with being a pencil. So just something to keep in mind. They're not going to be as soft as your traditional soft pastels if that's what you're used to, and it will affect how you blend and layer them. So what types of paper can you use your pastel pencils on? Well, the good news is you can pretty much use them on all the same papers you use your traditional soft pastels on. And there's even some overlap on what kinds of papers you can use them on that you may use your colored pencils on. I do a whole deep dive into pastel paper if you're interested. But for this, it works great on the Canson Mitance paper. And I'm just doing swatches of all of the different brands that I have on each paper, just so you can get a feel for how they all work. But they all work great on all the papers. Some of the brands are a little bit firmer, so they struggle on some of the softer papers, and the really highly textured ones, they can kind of scratch it up. But they work great on drawing paper. It won't take a lot of layers on really smooth drawing paper, but you can use it for sketching. It works great on Canson Mitance. This is the more textured side, but again, you can do more layers. Cold press watercolor paper, they work great on that. Some of how it responds to the paper depends on your technique. So how are you going to blend them? Are you going to do an underpainting? Are you using it for a fully rendered piece, or are you just doing quick figure sketches on them? So the type of paper you want and how much detail you want is going to affect which paper you choose. I probably wouldn't recommend these for a rough pressed watercolor paper. At least on the one I had, it was a little bit hard. The pencils were a little bit harder on it, and it was hard to fill in the tooth of the paper, so you're fighting the whites. I personally love them with sanded paper. So how do you blend your pastel pencils? So how do you blend pastel pencils? Well, it's similar to how you blend your traditional soft pastels. So you can use some kind of sponge like your soft tools or a makeup sponge. You can use a paper stump or a blending stump. You can use a rubber shaper or a cotton bud or your finger, though I don't always recommend your finger because that can leave oils. But if you're in a pinch, it works. all the similar ways that you can blend your soft pastels. And if you want to see more of that, I go into a deep dive of how to blend soft pastels in this video. But I have found that since they are a firmer type of pastel, they don't do kind of the traditional pastel layering blending technique where you layer your pastels and they blend on the paper in a way that you're not blending the pigments to be evenly covered, but you're blending them in a way that you can see kind of the color underneath peeking through the color on top, and it creates kind of this speckled effect. It's a little bit harder to achieve with your pastel pencils just because they come to a fine point, so it's harder to cover a broad area and they don't layer quite as well. And I found that the pipe foam doesn't blend them as well as some of the other options. So how can you create an underpainting using your pastel pencils? And why would you want to create an underpainting using your pastel pencils? Well, if you have pastel pencils and you don't have any other pastels, this is a great technique to fill in that area without having to pull out different supplies or buy more. And it just creates a lot more options in your process. So you can blend out your pastels using alcohol, just your regular rubbing alcohol, or using water. The benefit of using rubbing alcohol is that it dries really quickly. So you don't have to sit and wait for it to dry. And this is really good for papers that can't handle a ton of moisture. It isn't going to stay wet for a long time. The water's really nice for blending it out because you get a little bit more control on how it blends. You can get a little bit more gradient and variation, and it doesn't dry so quickly that it's drying before you can manipulate it and blend it. Alcohol, you can also see, creates a little bit more of a feathered technique and detail, especially on the sanded paper. So just something to keep in mind. Now, why would you want to create a toned paper? Well, if you only have white paper to work off of, this is a technique that can really make your paper more versatile. So if you are working on UART sanded paper like I am, and you want to do something that is very cool toned, it's a winter scene, well, you can do a blue wash with your pastel pencil and make it all the exact color of blue you want the base to be, so that you're not going to be spending a lot of time blending your pastels and trying to fill in the white showing through on your paper. It also doesn't take up any tooth of your paper, so doing something like this, it's so thin and fine, it's not going to use up some of those precious layers that you could have done. It also allows you to customize the toning in a very specific kind of way. So if you are doing a pet portrait and the dog has a black nose, and so you want to do a dark blue underpainting in that area to just make it darker, you can do this. You can get a dark blue pastel pencil, fill in that area, and just blend that area out individually. If he's standing on a field of green grass, you can quickly fill in the green area or the grass area green, or whatever undertone you want it to be, and make that area a different color. I find this is really helpful when I'm doing realism, but you can also use this for other techniques like playing with colors and just adding more options in your creativity. So what are some ways to blend your pastel pencils? I know this sounds pretty intuitive, but I wanted to kind of talk about different ways you can utilize this tool, because art supplies are expensive, and if you are looking into getting pastel pencils, it's good to know how you can use them, what other supplies you can use them with, and how to maximize your investment. So you can use pastel pencils for something like sketching or figure drawing. So if you don't like the feel of charcoal or quite how messy it is, you can use something like a pastel pencil to do your sketching for you. You can also use it to sketch out your full piece that you're going to be working on. I really like sketching out my project with a pastel pencil, because they are such a firm pastel, I don't worry about it filling in the tooth of the paper too quickly. You can also use a pastel pencils alone to create a fully rendered piece. So this flower was done using only pastel pencils, specifically Derwent pastel pencils. And I didn't even do any kind of underpainting technique or anything like that. It was just layering up pastels and blending them and trying to get detail. And this isn't a very big piece of paper. You can see compared to my hand, it's pretty small, but I still have a lot of room to do detail and lines, and I can kind of get into those small cracks. And that is the beauty of working with pastel pencils, is you can make it so highly detailed. Now this sketchbook is one that I made, and it has a protective sheet over it so that I don't have to worry about the pastel smudging in the sketchbook, just so that you know. And it's a form of sanded paper, and I'm just blending it out using a rubber shaper. But I can get really soft blends using just the pastels. It does take more time to fill in big areas using your pastels if you're not going to do an underpainting technique with it, but it is an option. Another awesome way that you can utilize your pastel pencils is by using them with other art supplies you might have. So this picture was done with pan pastels in the background, and then for the owl I used colored pencils, the Polychromos colored pencils, and I used my pastel pencils with it. So I did kind of the base layers with my Polychromos, and then anything that needed opacity or more blending, I layered my pastel pencils over the top. And this really allowed me to utilize the colors that I had in both sets, because I didn't have a lot of pastel pencils at this time, and I was really able to create some awesome looks, and it's one of my favorite ways to use my pastel pencils. And the background on those was done with my soft pastels. So you can use your pastel pencils with traditional soft pastels if you need to have any fine details. I would watch how you are layering them, because if you have a thick layer of soft pastel on your paper and you try to do pastel pencil over the top, it will scrape off what you've done. So traditionally go in with your harder pastels first, like your pastel pencils, and then do any tweaks or adjustments with your softer pastels. You can also use them with watercolor and ink. So for this picture, and I'm going to kind of show the rest of this show the rest of this eagle painting and pastel piece throughout the rest of the video as we chat. But I'm doing a watercolor underpainting. So I'm doing the background in watercolor, starting to block in the beak, and just making it a really specific type of underpainting to really help speed up the process and get a lot of those colors in where I want them and block it in. So kind of an orange yellow color for the nose. I'll block in some of the colors found in the eye. And since watercolor is such a thin medium, it works really, really well with your pastel pencils. With the pastel pencils being a little bit firmer, they're not as opaque as your traditional soft pastels. So they're more opaque than your colored pencils, but they're not as opaque as your traditional soft pastels. So something to keep in mind. As I continue working on this eagle, let's talk a little bit about brand specifics. So let's talk about the brands I have. I have Caran d'Ache, Derwent, Pitt Pastel, Carbothello, and Gioconda soft pastel pencils. Now, I'm not doing an in-depth review of these 5 brands in this video. That's for another time. I'm just going to be talking about some of the differences and what to know about each brand as we quickly review them. So what you can see is the color core on some of these pencils is a little bit thicker than some of the other ones. So Derwent and Caran d'Ache have the biggest core, and they are the thickest pencil out of the 5 that I have. But I haven't really found that if that's a pro or a con, because honestly, some of my other pencils sharpen easier than those do. The Caran d'Ache pencil is the newest brand to me in particular. I only have 8 pencils. The set was supposed to arrive a long time ago, but it's been back ordered because of COVID. The nice thing with Caran d'Ache is they have a really good star rating system on the side of the pencil. The more stars it has, the more light fast the pencil is. They also make the biggest range of colors. So they make 84 pastel colors to choose from. Pit Pastels by Faber-Castell are the brand that I use the most. These are kind of my workhorse pencils. They also have a star rating system on the side. They all have pigment numbers on the side of the pencils, and some of them have color names. This is just so you can replace a color in open stock. I have found that all the brands I own are available in open stock, just that Derwent, Caran d'Ache, and Faber-Castell are a little bit easier to find in open stock, whether it's in in-person stores or online. But they have pigment names so that you can replace them if you have a color that you happen to use a lot. Faber-Castell makes a set of 60 colors. Derwent makes a set of 72 colors. This is the Gioconda set, and they do a set of 48 colors. So they offer the smallest selection of colors, and I feel like they're the lightest in value. They don't go as dark, but they are the softest. So they're really great for those final layers, getting those final details in when you've done a lot of layers. The Stabilo Carbothello set has a star rating system on the side. Like the others, they come in 60 color options, and I would say they are some of the most vibrant and wide range of color options, but some of those really fun colors that they offer aren't always light fast. So now that you've been introduced to the pastel brands that I'm using in this video, you'll be able to identify them, kind of see how they work as I do more detail on the eagle. So you can see on the side all of the pencils I have lined up for this picture, and I have a wide range of all of the brands. I picked colors that I wanted because they all work well together. This makes it really helpful if you are building your selection quickly or slowly and you want to get specific colors that each brand offers, or if you have a set and you just want to expand upon the colors. It doesn't matter. They all work together. So I would pick colors that you want and a price point that you can afford, and don't feel pressured to buy something more expensive. Honestly, so far, the most expensive brand, the Caran d'Ache, are my least favorite pencils to work with. Granted, I've only worked with 8 of them, and I'm hoping that my feelings will change when I get the full set, but I found that they're a little bit trickier to sharpen, and they're a little bit more fragile, even though they're not as soft as some of the other ones. But they do have a really good color selection, and I really like their color saturation, so color-wise, I really, really like that brand. So just something to keep in mind. Also, sanded paper, when you're working on sanded paper, how hard or soft a brand is doesn't matter as much. I feel like sanded paper is kind of the great equalizer with a lot of these. You don't notice the subtlety of how soft or hard pastel pencils are. You would notice the difference between them and a traditional soft pastel, but amongst themselves, it's not as noticeable as it would be with a traditional cotton paper or something like that. But you can see that my hand is resting on kind of this semi-transparent piece of paper. This is called glassine paper, and it's kind of coated in a material so it's non-static, and it doesn't move or pick up any of the pastel underneath it. And so it allows me to rest my hand on the paper as I work without risk of my hand getting super covered in pastels. And I don't have to worry about smudging them, and I don't have to worry about oil transferring from my hand onto the paper. So I'm just building up the details. You could see how quickly that background blended out, and part of that is because I did the underpainting. It really sped up the blending process. I didn't have to worry about the white of the paper showing through, and I do a few more tweaks to it later on, but I didn't have to spend nearly as much time on the background for this as I did for the background on that much smaller purple flower that I showed earlier. But you can see I'm able to get quite a bit of detail in, and I don't even have these sharpened very much. I know some artists are a stickler on having like a super sharp point on their pencil all the time. I'm not. It doesn't really matter as much with sanded paper, but I'm still able to get quite a bit of detail in and layer up these pastels to get some really interesting and exciting effects. So let's talk about opacity when it comes to white pastel pencils. I did kind of a side-by-side comparison between the 5 brands, and I found that there was some differences between them. You can see with this first layer that I did that the Gioconda white pastel pencil is way more translucent than some of the other brands, even when I layer them up more. So this is really important information to know, because if you bought the Gioconda Soft Pastel Pencil set, you might not find the white in that set white enough for your most white highlights. So you might want to buy a different brand of white pencil, open stock, to just supplement that pastel set you already have. This sample is testing the whites over other pastels. So I chose kind of a darker blue pastel, and I am doing white over the top of it to see how much it picks up, how well it layers, all that kind of stuff. And again, you can see that white Gioconda pencil doesn't cover up much of that white. And granted, this is on cotton paper. If it was on sanded paper, it would be a little bit more forgiving. But this is just really helpful information, so that if you don't want to buy all of one color, you might want to buy a white of one brand that you know is really opaque to supplement what you have on hand. Another thing to keep in mind is that traditional soft pastels are going to be way more opaque than even these are. So if this isn't white enough for you, then you might want to buy a traditional soft pastel that is white to just add a few of those really bright highlights. But out of these, I found that the Caran d'Ache white is the most opaque, and it covers up the most, followed by the Derwent, then Faber-Castell, Carbothello, and then Gioconda at the end. So if you are looking for a good white pastel pencil, you can know that you can get Caran d'Ache or Derwent. Caran d'Ache is a little bit more money and can be a little harder to find, so I would go with the Derwent white. Now I am doing some of the detail on the feathers. I did some on the beak and around the eye, and I'm starting to block in some more around the feathers. And I'm just have this cream color, and I'm just blocking in where some of the whites of the feathers will be. And I'm also pulling in green tones, whether they're pale greens or a little bit stronger of green tones, just because the eagle, it has a green background behind it. And by pulling some of those greens into the feathers, it's going to make it look like the eagle belongs there and that it's not two separate things. That's just a good tip to have in general, is you want some of those background colors to affect the main person or animal or whatever it is in your portrait. And you don't want to use a color just in one spot of your picture. You kind of want to bounce it around, because that's going to keep it harmonious and look like everything goes together. Now I'm just taking some dark pastels and just layering up some of these darker colors and really building up the shadows. I don't want to focus too much on the whites yet, because the white isn't really going to stand out unless there's a darker value next to it to help it pop. So I added a little bit of the cream tone. That's partly just to help this all blend when I start mixing them together. But just adding some blues and greens and browns to start building up the shadow tones before I do the bright white highlights. So let's compare how hard and soft these pastels are amongst these 5 pastel pencil brands. I would say the Koh-i-Noor is the softest. They are really good for those final details if you have used up a lot of the tooth of the paper. The next softest I would say is the Carbothello pastel pencils. Those ones glide really well and are really buttery. The Faber-Castell Pit Pastel pencils are kind of middle of the road. Derwent are really similar to the Faber-Castell ones, but I would say a lot of them are a little bit harder and firmer in texture. The Caran d'Ache pencils are a little bit up in the air because I haven't tried the full set like I have of the other brands. I've only tried 8 colors. But of the 8 colors I have, I would say most of them are around the same hardness level as the Derwent or Faber-Castell. They're pretty firm pastel pencils, but they are a little bit more fragile and crumbly. At least the colors I have. So just something to keep in mind. So after I did my test with the whites, I wanted to test the black pastel pencils and kind of see how they vary across brands. And what I found is there is a variation in how dark the blacks of each brand went. It's a little hard to see in this example, so I will show you a clip or a photograph in better lighting of a practice piece I worked on. But the Gioconda pencil is by far the most black. You can see the swatch, the vertical swatch on the far left is by far blacker than all the other ones. Next up, I would say it would be the Stabilo and the Faber-Castell. They're pretty similar. I'd say Stabilo's a little bit darker. And then the Derwent was quite a bit lighter than all the other ones. When it was next to all the other brands, I would say it was almost like a charcoal color, not pure black. But they all are great at opacity. They cover up what's underneath them. It's just how dark do you want to push it. So if you have the Derwent set of pastel pencils or you're looking at getting it, I would recommend getting maybe the Gioconda black pencil to just add to your supply so you have a nice extra dark black for those values. Speaking of value, now that I've darkened up the values of where the shadows from the feathers are, I'm going to add the highlights of the feathers, taking my Derwent white and just starting to block in some of the really bright highlights from those feathers. And I'll blend it in and I'll kind of vary it up a bit. But working from this kind of mid-tone, darker value to lighter really is a lot quicker, especially on something like this where the feathers have such fine details that I don't want to draw those fine details in white and then have to go around each of them to darken them up. But the fun thing about pastels is you can blend them and layer them. It reminds me a lot of oil painting where you have a long time to blend. And you can blend these indefinitely until the pigment's off the paper. So you can achieve such awesome works of art using soft pastels, and they're one of my favorites. Again, I'm using this rubber tool to blend in and soften up the edges of the highlights, but without losing too much detail. It doesn't overblend like sometimes a sponge or a cotton bud can do. So now that we have gone into detail learning about what pastel pencils are, how they compare to colored pencils versus soft pastels, some brands of them, how they work, how they layer, all that jazz. What are the pros and cons of pastel pencils, and are they the right art supply for you? So the pros for pastel pencils are they are an opaque medium, so you can work from dark to light. You can cover up a mistake as long as you haven't filled in the tooth of the paper. So they're a little bit more forgiving. You can blend them as much as you want. These are all things that people love about traditional soft pastels, but something people struggle with traditional pastels, and chalk also falls in that category, is they do not like the way it feels on their hands. So some people can't stand the texture and how it feels, and they don't like their hands being dirty all the time. Pastel pencils are a great kind of solution for that because you can get a lot of the benefits that you get with soft pastels, but your hands aren't going to get as dirty. You can sharpen them. You're not going to get as much dust since they are a firmer pastel. So they're a little bit messier than your traditional colored pencils, but they're not nearly as messy as a traditional soft pastel. I wouldn't say you need any kind of air purifying system or anything like that, which sometimes you will need if you're working with soft pastels a lot. Another positive with them is that they're really similar to pencils, so you can get as much detail as you want. They're also easier to travel with. As long as you have a case that kind of holds them still and keeps them from like getting dropped, they're a lot smaller and they're not as fragile as your traditional soft pastels. So I like to take them a lot when I do plein air pastel work because they are really, they're a little bit more durable. If I drop a pencil, I might break the core, but I don't have to worry about the whole thing disintegrating from one drop. The pastel pencils can be used with a lot of mediums. So if you have watercolors, you can use pastel pencils over the top of those. If you have traditional pastels, you can use these to do your fine detail work. If you have colored pencils, you can use these over the top. Just one thing to keep in mind, the pastel pencils don't develop a sheen. So they're not going to layer up over your wax-based pencils if you use up the tooth of the paper. And they might have a little bit difference of a sheen quality, especially if you aren't working on a sanded paper. What are some cons to pastel pencils? Well, they can be a little bit harder to cover a large area, and they can be time consuming. They're faster than colored pencils, but they are slower than your traditional soft pastels. So you can use them in conjunction with your other art supplies to help speed it up, whether you have watercolor or something like that. Or you can do some kind of underpainting, like what I showed earlier, to kind of negate that problem. But they can be pretty time consuming if you're trying to fill up a large area and you want it to be kind of an even color coverage. They range in cost per pencil, and they can be, I feel like they're a little bit more money for how much pigment you get than a lot of the traditional soft pastels. So you're paying extra for the wood and having them be able to be sharpened and things like that. So for how much pigment you get, I feel like they're a little bit more. And another con is they smudge a lot. So they can be a little bit trickier to store. They're harder to use in a sketchbook setting, things like that, because of the color transfer. And sometimes the pigment can flake off of your picture. So if that's something that bothers you, this might not be the right medium for you to use. Another con is they can be a little bit harder to find out and about. I've noticed that pastels in general aren't as popular of a medium as oils or acrylics or watercolor or graphite. So sometimes your local stores don't really carry much of a selection of pastels in general, and pastel pencils kind of fall in that category. I find they're really easy to find online at a wide variety of places, but if you're someone that likes to order them or pick them up in person, it can be a little bit harder to get a hold of them, and even some of the replacement colors in open stock. Granted, I think I mentioned it earlier, Derwent and Faber-Castell are a little bit easier to find in just your in-person art stores. So who would I recommend pastel pencils for? Well, if you love working with pastels, then this might be a great way to supplement your collection already and be able to add fine details and things like that. If you want to do super realistic portraits and be able to get really soft blends really easily, these are a great option for you. If you are frustrated with colored pencils because you can't blend as easily and you have to really gradually layer it up, this might be a great art supply for you. Also, it's a little bit more forgiving. Since they're more opaque, you can cover up mistakes a little bit more easily, where sometimes colored pencil can be a little bit trickier. If you love the look of pastels, but you hate the feel of them on your hands because they might feel too dry or something like that, then this might be a good solution for you, especially if you use it in conjunction with pan pastels, which you use tools to apply it to your paper. Between the two of them, you can create really fantastic pastel pieces without getting very much pastel on your hands, if at all. So it kind of helps that solution. If you don't like pastels because of the dust they create, but you're not anti-dust altogether, then this might be a supply for you. If you want to kind of change up how you work with colored pencils or want to experiment with the supplies you have, these are a great way to kind of supplement it and kind of mix up what you're doing and give you more options of the art you create. I wouldn't recommend these for someone that is like anti-dust and mess altogether. If you work really cleanly and you don't like your art dust getting dirty at all, these are still going to be a little too messy for you, even though they're cleaner than your traditional soft pastels. If you don't like having to be fussy with how you sharpen a pencil, you might not like these because they can be a little bit trickier to sharpen. Some of them sharpen in my electric X-Acto sharpener fantastically. Others do better with like a hand sharpener. And some of them, the brand recommends you sharpen them with a knife. And if that seems like too much fuss or worry for you, then they might not be the right supply for you. If you don't like the risk of your artwork smudging when you're done, then this might not be the right supply for you either, because pastels still can smudge. They never have, it's not like they have a drying time and then they become adhered to the paper like oil paints. They will smudge indefinitely. You can use like a spray fixative to help hold it on, but that can alternate the color and create some sheens on your picture. Something to keep in mind. So when you store it, if it's not going to be under glass, you usually have to wrap it in some kind of cover. I usually use glassine paper to protect my picture from smudging. These aren't great for sketchbook work. So if you work in a sketchbook a lot, these might not be the best option for sketchbook work. So that is about it on our pastel pencil deep dive. I'm almost done with this eagle, and I hope this really illustrates all that you can create with pastel pencils. This picture I'm working on is about 9 inches by 11 inches, so it's not a very large picture, and I'm still able to create a lot of detail pretty quickly and be able to cover large areas and get soft blends. I did not fill up the tooth of this paper at all. I could have kept going for hours and made it even more realistic with a lot more details on the feathers if I had wanted to. But I chose to focus and keep the sharper details in the eye and beak area and kind of just let everything else soften out as it got away from that space. But yeah, I hope this helped answer any questions you have about pastel pencils. Hopefully it gave you some more information on how to work with them. If you have any questions, leave them down below and I will do my best to answer them for you. And if you like this video, please hit the like button. And if you want to see more of what I create, please hit the subscribe button and notification bell. I've been uploading a lot more regularly, and I have a lot more pastel content in general that I'm going to be creating for you. So I hope you have a fantastic day, and I will see you next time. Bye.